This is Macro Analytics, delivering frank conversations on global macroeconomics and market analysis, outside the mainstream, featuring discussions and debates between Gordon T. Long, publisher and editor of GordonTLong.com, and his guests. The content of this discussion is strictly the opinion of the participants. It is in no way a solicitation for business, nor is it to be considered investment advice of any sort. Always consult a registered investment advisor before making any investment decision. These discussions are extremely hard-hitting and terribly frank, and parental discretion is advised. Now, on to the show.
Good morning. I'm Gord Long with GordonTLong.com, and I have back with me again this morning John Rubino, well-known author and publisher of the website Dollar Collapse. Welcome back, John.
Hey, Gordon. Thanks for having me back.
I enjoyed the first session we had this week on talking about moral hazard, unintended consequences, and dysfunctional capital markets. Clearly, there's just so much to talk about. And in future shows, I'm hoping that we'll be able to take each one of those and explode them into more detail, because a lot of your writings, you've done a great job of covering them off and explaining the real world impacts of them, whether the food industry or whatever particular area. So I'm looking forward to being able to do that. But this morning, John, I wanted to really lead into articles you've already written that talk to this in a little bit different manner. And the first one I have up, I was hoping we could talk about, is your recent article on the long wave versus the printing press. And that is really timely that the central banks are all in now.
Long wave theory in general is fascinating because there are two or three different approaches out there that are kind of popular, and they all deal with how societies go through 50, 60, 70-year cycles that are really psychological cycles. You know, we have some hard times, and then the generation that experiences that is very conservative for a while, and the financial markets reflect that conservatism. And then succeeding generations have less and less of a memory of the hard times and get cockier and cockier, and the financial system reflects that. You know, debt increases and the type of debt gets more and more risky, and then that leads eventually to a collapse. And the interesting thing about this is that no matter which long wave theory you look at, they pretty much all say 2000 was the peak of the cycle and that we should have collapsed. When the tech stock bubble burst, that should have been it for this 70-year cycle. You know, since the Depression or World War II or wherever you start it, 2000 should have been the end, and we should have fallen into what the Kondratieff Wave theory calls Kondratieff winter. And we didn't really. You know, we somehow have managed to hang on and not be in a depression in the last 10 years. And I think the reason that that's been true is that in past long waves, all the world central banks didn't have unlimited printing presses. You know, this is the first time we've confronted a long wave collapse with fiat currencies that could be created in infinite quantities. And so we've been able to do really extreme monetary things in the last 10 or 15 years to stave off the collapse. And your listeners know about quantitative easing, and they know about zero interest rates and about what's going on in Europe right now, and the promises of more of the same going forward. And those things have managed to keep us from collapsing. And so now the question becomes, have we managed to discredit the whole economic law of the long wave? In other words, is that not valid anymore, or are we delaying the inevitable? And I think it's pretty obvious that we're delaying the inevitable. You know, the central banks of the world have gone all in. They're basically producing as much new fiat currency as it takes to keep the system from collapsing, but in the process, they're creating a much more complex financial system. You know, the show we did before on unintended consequences gives a lot of examples of that, where zero interest rates are leading people to behave in ways that are basically crazy, but are rational in the context of the expectation that the central bank is going to bail you out of whatever trouble you get into. And so the long wave, I think, is still out there. It's still waiting to happen. It hasn't been violated. It's only been delayed. And so now the question becomes, how long can we delay it with our new monetary tools, and what's the inevitable consequence? And I think, you know, the consequence is probably an even bigger crash out there and an even longer Kondratieff winter, but it remains to be seen because we've never been here before.
I agree, John, with the last part of that because we've delayed somewhat the adjustment process that has to happen will be more difficult, will be bigger, will be harsher. I have a slightly different view. I believe what's happened has absolutely proved the legitimacy of the long wave. And that is that I believe that in fact it's happening and has happened. And my point would be, you have to understand the difference between real and nominal. If you take stock markets and you look at them in real terms, and that is you denominate them in gold, oil, whatever you want to use, or just inflation, but use a realistic inflation rate such as John Williams or some factor, you will see that in December through January of 2000, almost perfectly aligned, very close to the long wave, we in fact started a downtrend and our downline, and we've been in a secular bear market ever since in real terms. In nominal terms, it doesn't reflect that. And so what I would argue, John, is it's just confused what's happening. It's in fact hiding what's happening. If you would, we're papering it over by debasement of currencies, but because it's all across the board of universal fiat currencies, it's somewhat hidden unless you measure it against some kind of real asset value. So, but clearly it's getting worse because we're not addressing the fact. And the only way we see it is when forced non-performing loans are forcing adjustments and write-downs. It's a little different view.
Gordon, I accept everything you just said. If you value, for instance, the U.S. stock market in gold, which is how we valued it during the Great Depression, it has behaved pretty much the way stocks did in the early 1930s. You know, the stock market in the U.S. has tanked when it's measured in gold.
Exactly.
And so has GDP. And if you measure unemployment the way we measured it up until the 1980s, it's much, much higher than the officially stated number.
See, John, I have done work on GDP, and even our GDP numbers are totally bogus if you calculate them correctly. And I say that using a correct deflator that in fact is reflecting the monetary increase in base and therefore what money is buying in whatever the basket of goods that you want to determine. But we play so many games, whether it's hedonics, it's various kinds of adjustments, and I've done an extensive amount of work just to show you how flawed both GDP and inflation are. And that's what's camouflaging it. But we don't have growth. And the long wave says even growth would collapse. And that's what's happening on a global basis right now. We're actually in contraction.
Yeah, historians, when they untangle all of this, will probably date the global collapse at 2000.
Yes.
And but my point is that most people don't feel the way people felt in 1933 in the U.S. You know, we haven't completely gotten it yet because in part because the numbers are lies.
John, I would say that the media hasn't got it. I would say that people don't articulate it, but I think everybody knows it's going on, and there's a vast majority of Americans who are feeling it so harsh they know. They just can't believe that the leaders and everybody can't see it, that they know that they're in a silent and a real depression right now.
Well, they know that times are hard, and they know that their situation is way more difficult than it was a decade or 2 decades ago. So, you know, in the 1930s, there wasn't welfare the way we know it today. So you had these tent cities, and you had these huge long lines outside unemployment offices and soup kitchens and things like that. And today, you know, you turn on the news and you don't see things like that because we've set up a system, which is thanks to, you know, paper money and unlimited government borrowing. We set up a system that basically maintains some semblance of a living standard for people, even when they fall on hard times. You know, what is it, like one out of 4 Americans now gets a check from the government in some way, and 1 out of 7 people are on food stamps. You know, we've set up a system that has kept the really harsh aspect of depression from destroying lives. And we've done that at the cost of immense amounts of new borrowing, which will cause the depression to be that much worse in the future. But I don't think a lot of people feel this the way the guys in the 1930s felt it when they were out of work. They couldn't feed their families. They didn't have a place to live. And you know, middle class people 3 years prior. had to go through all that because right now you lose your job and you get a check every month, and then you move in with the part of your family that's still working. Things go on, and they're hard, but they aren't as hard as they're going to be. My point is we haven't hit the 1930s yet psychologically for a lot of people, and we will.
I agree with that point, John. And it's part of what we talked about in the first point. We have an open loop here, and therefore there's no pain. So, for example, in the 30s when we had the Depression, people were riding the freight trains. And why were they riding the freight? They were looking for work. They had to go anywhere in America to find a job. Now, there were no jobs, but they couldn't find them, but they were doing that. Today, we don't do that. And the reason we don't do it is because we have some kind of payment scheme that hides the problems. So we don't see soup lineups like we used to see, or we would expect to see. But I would argue too, John, those are there. If you ever go down to a food distribution centers for the poor and the homeless right now, the lineups are unbelievable. We're serving and I live in a fairly well-to-do town near Boston. We're serving 510 families now in our town who can't make a go of it. And these people are what you would think are relatively well-to-do, but they're not. They may have a house and they may have a car, but they don't have anything. And additionally, John, if you want to see it, and I am agreeing very much with yourself. I'm trying to point out how camouflaged it is. You want to see the lineups? Go to a Walmart at the end of the month when everybody gets their final new food stamp cards that comes out for the beginning of the month. Walmart has to go double up on their staff because everybody, when that midnight strikes, everybody's now buying the basics that haven't been able to get at the tail end of a month. And as a matter of fact, they're opening up stores, keeping them open till 3 a.m. to be able to do this. So they're there, but they're hidden from us, and they certainly aren't covered by the media.
Yeah, that it's a silent depression,
yes,
I think is undeniable. It's happening out there, and it's touching a lot of lives that you wouldn't have expected in good times to have to go through what they're going through. And the question is, when does it stop being silent? When does it become a story in the mainstream media with visuals? And I think we're not far from that. It might take some kind of an external shock. Maybe the stock market has to tank, which is a nice lead-in to hard times from a narrative standpoint from the news media, or something else. There's lots of things that could happen to turn a silent depression into something that everybody is aware of and everybody sees on the news. And it's only a matter of time before it happens. Because, as we've repeated a few times here, we're just making things worse by trying to stave off what needed to be a cleansing of excessive debt in the system. And so, whether it happens this year or next year or 3 years from now, it's definitely coming. And so the 1930s in living color, will be back, or Weimar Germany followed by the 1930s. Something extreme is coming, because the numbers don't permit anything else, but, the timing and the details of it are still to be determined.
You had a second article that on bankrupt world is an unstable world.
The corollary to financial crisis is usually some kind of a geopolitical thing, because when a country goes bankrupt, its government does not want to be blamed for that bankruptcy. So they start looking around for an external enemy to distract their people with. And, you've seen this happen dozens of times in not too distant history. And it's happening again now. It's not a surprise that all of a sudden China and Japan are on the verge of a shooting war over these islands that nobody could care less about 6 months ago in the China Sea. Okay. And that all of a sudden Israel and Iran are on the verge of some kind of a bombing raid, followed by retaliation, followed by a cutoff of the oil flow through the Straits of Hormuz. These things seem like they're on the verge of happening. And one of the reasons that they're happening now instead of 2 years ago or 5 years from now is that the world is getting poorer and poorer, and governments are being blamed for it, and they want a distraction. And so we should expect to see more and more stuff like this go on out there just because it's historically normal. It's kind of commonsensical, and it's something that history says happens at times like this. And the problem now, as opposed to times past, is that we've never been this financially fragile. So let China and Japan get into something that screws up Asian trade and exports, or let the Middle East blow up and cut off the supply of oil. And what was a mess in the 1970s would be a catastrophe now, because we're far more indebted than we were. And, we talked about derivatives in our last show, and let something like what we're talking about happen, and the derivatives market will just freeze up, because all of a sudden all these credit default swaps that are based on bonds that are in some way connected to the energy market or the Asian market or the European market, those things just blow up. And so all the counterparties have to make good, and they can't make good, and then they fail, and they become, counterparties for somebody else who fails. And it snowballs into a catastrophic failure of the global financial system, which then leads to a bailout by taxpayers via, some kind of, quantitative easing to the nth degree and a currency crisis. So, you get these things as a catalyst for a financial system collapse that would be something like nobody's seen in human history. And so that, besides just the immediate scariness of Iran and Israel having a war or something like that, you get a global financial reverberation that is completely unpredictable. Except that we know it would be really bad. The details are yet to be determined, but they would be very nasty when they come.
Yeah, history is replete that when we're in situations like this, that usually a geopolitical event not only distracts everybody from the economic and financial crisis that's going on, it actually leads us into a much more severe one, but people are then engaged in the fallout of the geopolitical event. Sometimes it's a natural disaster, but a geopolitical event, the tip has often in history been a new war. I'm not saying we're about to face a war, but conflict of some manner that forces dramatic social changes to be incurred. That is, assets have to be seized because of the fallout of a financial crisis. Martial law has to be declared because there's a breakdown in food supplies because of trade numbers that can't support the flow of goods and services in some fashion, etc. It could be a cyber war, and therefore the internet itself is jeopardized, and therefore some kind of major disruption. And then under this guise or this camouflage, if you read history, change is put in. Unfortunately, John, a lot of times this change that comes of a new leader or a new event is not necessarily the best one. And the example of that is the fallout of the First World War was hyperinflation in Germany because of the Versailles Agreement, and then the Weimar Republic and the inflation, and who rose out of that was Hitler. And because he came, and the German people weren't stupid, he came along and he had real solutions that they believed in, started to show results, and suddenly a crackpot was in charge. I'm not suggesting that's what's in front of us, but it is the kinds of things we need to be incredibly wary of right now, going forward.
Oh, absolutely. And there are lots of other examples that are less extreme than Hitler, but still absolutely terrifying. Like, France in the late 1700s destroyed their currency, and they got Napoleon a few years later, which ushered in, 15, 20 years of European war. And, things like that are so common that they're actually a normal part of the process. So, financial crisis leads to geopolitical crisis, and then financial crisis again in this, potentially never-ending cycle.
John, it's so standard and so consistent that also what comes out of it is the political apparatus of leadership of people that have decided that they have to use these situations, in fact, to solve problems they can't do any other way. And therefore what comes out of it is them proactively, if you would, instigating it in something that's referred to as false flags. And false flags are constructed events that force actions and therefore the people to come along. And whether it was the Maine in the Spanish-American War, the Lithuania in the First World War, whether it was the Gulf of Tonkin, the Bay of during the Vietnam War, I can go on, or Pearl Harbor, it's just a consistent pattern where an event triggered political action. In every one of those cases, they took us into a war.
Mm-hmm. And that's part of the government looking for an external enemy. And if you can't find one who's waiting to attack you, you organize it somehow so it looks like they did.
John, I'm not trying to be a conspiracy buff here in my comments. I'm actually talking as a historian.
Yeah, these are documented. There is no argument among historians that a lot of this stuff.
Exactly.
We've perpetrated false flags for centuries.
It's a consistent pattern. It's an understood pattern by anybody who's studied political science and history. I just want to make sure that our listeners understand that this is not some conspiracy statement. These are just the facts of how the geopolitical system works on a global basis.
Yeah, so there's a lot of speculation out there now about how we're going to make it look like Iran starts the next fight. And, it'll be interesting to see if that's the way it plays out. And if it does, we need to keep in mind our history as we try to judge, who did it and what the consequences should be.
I'm not trying to put Iran up, or if you look at the military bases that are surrounding Iran right now, the overpowering sheer numbers of them, you look at the military actions that are now going on, military exercises in the Straits of Hormuz. If you look at the other kinds of penalties that are being imposed from Iran, what they would see is a bully kicking sand in their face, and they're not taking the bait. They are, because they know what's they're being set up for as an excuse, and they're just not taking it. It's a sad state of affairs because it's blatantly obvious, as bad as Iran is. But you look at Israel right now; they're beating the drum pretty hard, and they're literally got a red line that they've drawn and says, "Here's where we make our move."
Yeah.
I don't know if you've seen that.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I just downloaded Benjamin Netanyahu's speech to the United Nations.
That's what I'm referring to.
Yeah, fascinating speech because it was really an unfiltered view of the right wing of Israel's point of view here. And it has a logical consistency to it if you accept some of the premises. And it leads to some kind of war if it's carried to its logical extreme and put up against the narrative of the mullahs who run Iran. You've got a couple of very incompatible worldviews there bumping up against each other in real time with deadlines. And so who knows? But it could be easily something we wake up in the morning and find out that the war has started, oil is $200 a barrel, and the U.S. stock market is down by 1,000 points. This could all happen some morning before we wake up.
The roadmap I laid out during 2008, 2009, actually before that, at 2008-9, I said that the financial crisis that we were in was going to lead to an economic crisis, which would then lead to a political crisis. And out in here into 2012, 2013, we're marching to that drum because these are natural sequences of how these unfold. Once you get into the political crisis, which we're now entering into and have been for a while, politicians in the political apparatus react in very predictable fashions, especially when they're under debt crisis, when they don't have enough money to spend, or they themselves are in jeopardy of losing power. And we're in that position now, and the grid that I have up shows that, in fact, there's a cascading series of financial instruments that have led, whether it was the credit default swaps, whether initially collateralized debt obligations leading to the credit default swaps. And I see that as we're moving into this $700 trillion swaps marketplace, which is an unintended consequences of the fiat currency collapse and the problems that we have built into with this monetary malfeasance and monetary malpractice. The only way out of resetting is going to be through some serious political readjustments, whatever you want to call them. Well, I call them a war. I'm not necessarily saying it's a war, but a serious releveling of territories and assets.
And, the other side of this is what's happening domestically in the U.S., because you see the U.S. government actively preparing for civil unrest. They're laying the groundwork for a police state in a lot of different areas of our lives. They're via if they can't do it legally, they're doing it through just the president declaring whatever.
The growth in executive orders is so scary, the number of them, and we have no visibility of any real magnitude to them in terms of our political system approving them. And some of them are secret, so you can't even look at them. You can't see them. But if there's a common theme that you go through them, John, they all seem to be aimed at exactly what you're saying. For whatever reasons, I won't speculate on what those reasons may be.
Well, they can read a balance sheet too, so they're worried about the result of all the debt that they're taking on, and civil unrest could be part of it. So they're setting up the ability to take over the internet if they have to, the ability to arrest American citizens without due process and just put us away for a while if they feel like they have to. They're setting up surveillance systems that are blatantly unconstitutional. They can read all the emails and that go across the internet right now, or all the international phone calls. And it used to be, in the not too distant past, to check out one individual international phone call, you had to get a warrant. And now they've got systems that just monitor everything, and find keywords and pull up the results of the keywords. And they've got data mining systems that basically allow them to tie it all together and to follow individuals across all their electronic communications. And these are things that should be terrifying to people, but because it's in the guise of the war on terror, they're getting away with it. But you put all the different pieces together, and you've got a newborn big brother here that is going to have the power to basically monitor all our communications and then pick us up if they don't like what we're saying and cause us to disappear. And at some point, if things get crazy enough, they'll actually start doing this stuff. They have the ability to do it now. And so it comes down to whether we trust them or not. And the history of democratic elections don't give a lot of cause for hope. We've elected some crazies here in the U.S. and crazies in other places have been elected too. So the next one that comes along, the next Nixon or whoever, is going to find that they basically have a ready-made turnkey police state, all right there, ready to be turned on and put into practice. And, we should all be worried about that. But it is a normal outgrowth of the coming bankruptcy. They get it and they understand that things are going to get very hard and very crazy here, and they want to be able to control it when it happens.
I think that's what we really know for a fact, John, is that the government believes something's coming at some point and are preparing in some way for what is probably almost a given. They may not know when or how. You could speculate all day whether they do, but clearly all of the actions indicate that they see something coming that you and I, frankly, also have seen coming for quite some time. So the best to our listeners is be warned and be prepared, because it's something on the horizon. John, we're once again up against our hard line. It just seems like we just get into a subject and we're out of time, but we need to wrap here for this week. A couple great conversations with you. Any last comments you'd like to make?
No, I think we covered this pretty well, Gordon. But you're right. We only scratched the surface of these subjects because they're so big. Whole books could be written on basically any of the 15, 20-minute topics that we talk about here. So I enjoyed it.
I have up our roadmap, and clearly the last subject we were just talking about, the impact of the Fed and the monetary policies, but I'm really concerned about is this move towards statism, of the infringement on our constitutional rights and the changes that are happening subtly, executive orders or whatever. I'm not even saying whether there's good reasons for them or not, but the fact that they are occurring is something that we're going to talk about in future shows. Not to be conspiratorial, just to be factual here. Just pure research, market research, because as an investor, you have to face the facts, right? Could you please tell us how our listeners could learn more about the work that you're doing and how they could follow it more closely?
Sure. I run dollarcollapse.com, which is a website that covers this stuff on an ongoing basis.
John, until we meet again next month, take care of yourself, and I hope the markets are good to you.
Great. Thanks, Gordon.
Talk to you later. Bye.
This has been Gordon T. Long, editor and publisher of GordonTLong.com. New recordings are posted regularly and can be found at GordonTLong.com. New show notifications are available through RSS feed, iTunes, and other social networking venues at GordonTLong.com.